This is part two of chapter 15. In this part, we are going to be making the link between social change and social problems. Most of the material in this presentation from this part of the lecture notes is new material that goes beyond what's in the textbook, so please pay attention carefully and take notes as needed. So, in part one, we discussed um, social change, the definition of social change, and the relationship between social change and social revolutions. And that part one ended with a discussion of although social change is inevitable, every generation has its own kind of unique collection of resources and constraints that can either encourage or discourage social change and progress, as well as encourage and discourage people to get involved. And I ended that presentation with a discussion about why that's a focus in sociology. And so that's where I want to start this part two by reminding you that in sociology, at the core of our discipline, we have this what either is considered to be two core commitments or two core contradictions, depending on your stance. And that is, do we merely analyze society, or do we analyze society with the explicit focus of engaging and encouraging societal reform? And so for people that imagine that it is two core commitments, they see this as working hand in hand, that you use the sociological eye, perspective, imagination to understand and analyze how society works. But then you don't stop there. You then take that information and you take action in some way. You participate actively in efforts to improve and reform society. And so at the very beginning of this course, I mentioned that have traditionally been two types of sociologists, those that are strictly analysis, and then those who believe in both analysis and reform. And that kind of distinction about where you see or what you see as being the focus of the discipline, still exists today. Although we are probably one of the more progressive disciplines in the sense that contemporary sociologists are much more likely to indicate that they feel like there needs to be this relationship between studying society, studying the world around you, and then using that information to try to improve upon society. So, how do you know what needs to be improved upon in society? Well, one way you can address that is by acknowledging and addressing what we call social problems. So, social problems are often described as issues in society that represent a discrepancy between society's ideals and their actual achievements. So, it's kind of this discrepancy between our ideology, right, our beliefs and values, and then kind of real culture, like how does this really play out in our society? And so, we might say, that that education is an important pathway to upward mobility, and it should be based on meritocracy and individual achievement. But is our educational system set up in such a way that it's reflected, that those beliefs are reflected in how we set up our society? We might say that everyone deserves civil liberties, and these rights that were outlined at the beginning of our country's history. But if people are experiencing kind of pervasive, systematic prejudice and discrimination, then once again, there's this discrepancy between what we say about our society, what we ideally want our society to be, and who we really are. And so if this seems kind of subjective, another way you can kind of address if is something a social problem is by asking these four questions, to kind of see, is this problem, does it meet the criteria of being a social problem? First of all, is there a public outcry? the social and social problem indicates that enough people care and are interested about this topic. Now, there are some topics that people should care more about, and you can certainly try to build interest and engagement around those topics. But in order for it to be considered a social problem, it does have to kind of reach some type of tipping point in terms of the public being aware about it and caring about it. The second question really reflects the definition that I just went over. Does this condition reflect a gap between societal ideals and social reality? Does the matter have national attention? So social problems are problems that exist at the national level. They aren't just like local problems, like we need more speed bumps in this specific neighborhood. It is something that is of national interest, and therefore everyone in the country, or at least a majority of people in the country, are aware of this being an issue and a problem. It's something that they've heard of. And the final one, in a way, is the most important, because is there a solution for the problem? There are horrible things that exist in the world, and you can certainly, feel bad about them, and you can stay up all night worrying about them. But social problems are very solution focused and oriented, because if we can fix it, then the idea is that we should try to fix it. But if it's not fixable, then it might just be a social condition, a condition of human life, a condition of a given society. And so there has to be an available solution, or, several solutions out there in order for it to be considered a social problem. And so when it comes to social problems, who's oftentimes responsible for pointing out, hey, there's a social problem, this is a problem in society, versus who are the people that then fix it. So we can talk about this in terms of defining the problem and fixing the problem. People who define the problems, these are people that collect data, that tell stories, that generate interest and awareness. So you might want to think about examples of careers that relate to defining the problem, as being people like journalists, certainly academics, who collect data and information on the problem, policy think tank writers, authors, in some cases, educators. Educators can be both definers and fixers of problems. It kind of depends on, if they're just kind of spreading knowledge or if they're trying to address an issue. So all of those are the people that are kind of responsible for bringing a problem to people's attention, of generating that national level interest, of making sure that the public is aware and the public realizes, that this is a problem. And sometimes the definers of the problems, they also need to, and this is particularly true for academics and researchers, they need to objectively gather data to see, is this a problem? But the definers of the problem rarely are the people who then come up with the solutions and then carry them out. So who is it in society that fixes the problems? Well, certainly politicians, whether it's at the local, state, or national level, but particularly national level politicians, judges, who it's up to them to kind of interpret case law and set precedent. People who have jobs responsible for carrying out the policies passed by politicians. So this would be, like I mentioned before, educators, but it also could be police officers, it could be medical practitioners, it could be social workers, right? So if you have a job that requires you to kind of be aware of policies and procedures meant to address social problems, and then it's your job to then carry those policies and procedures out effectively, you could call yourself a fixer of the problem. Now, of course, which one do you think it is? Which one do you think is more difficult? Which one do you think is judged more harshly? Obviously, it's the fixers of the problems. It's definitely a lot easier to gather the data, to increase people's awareness, to try to engage people around the issue. But it is difficult to, try to come up with solutions, and then to kind of carry out those solutions effectively. And then if those solutions don't work, to go back to the drawing board and come up with new solutions. solutions, right? So although these two sets of occupations, the definers of problems and the fixers of problems, they work hand in hand. Certainly the fixers are the people that, for better or for worse, are either congratulated when solutions work well, or criticized when solutions do not work well. So the rest of this presentation is going to focus on all the ways in which we can kind of describe solutions to these social problems. And so one of the first ways we can kind of distinguish between solutions is talking about ideal versus practical solutions. So ideal solutions are the solutions, the best solution you can dream up in a world where money and time and resources are not an issue, right? So, if I wanted to come up with an ideal solution for homelessness, it might just be I'm going to give every homeless person in America a free house, and I'm going to make it so that they, don't have to pay rent and they can live for free, right? Obviously that is an ideal solution in the sense that it's kind of divorced from the reality of, in a lot of places, there are housing shortages, and, how can we, and it's costly to build homes and upkeep. So if people aren't paying into their homes, how would that work? But that's the, I guess, great thing about ideal solutions is these are your dream solutions. You don't really have to address how would they really work. If you want to answer the question, how will this really work in society, that's a practical solution, because practical solutions reflect what can actually be done given a society's resources and limitations. And, those limitations can be related to time, they can be related to cost, they can be related to like public approval. Oftentimes there's a conflict between the two, right? It's very rare that our ideal solution is really one that we can put into practice as as it is. Reality just being what it is, there are always some constraints in place. Like I said, whether it's related to time, whether it's related to organization, whether it's related to cost. So another way that we can talk about solutions besides ideal and practical is to talk about them in regards to preventative or after the fact measures. So preventative is when you try to come up with a solution that prevents the problem from happening, right? While after the fact is a solution that's meant to kind of address the consequences, the effects of the problem. So, do we focus on preventing it from occurring, or do we fix it after it's already happened or it's already problematic? Another way of describing these types of solutions is to use the word upstream or downstream. If we catch the problem upstream, we're catching it at its start, at its root, before it becomes a problem. If we're catching it downstream, that means it's already a problem, it's already happened. And those terms upstream, downstream, comes from this little anecdote that my public health professor used to tell in class all the time. Two people are walking by a river, and they see a body float by, and then a couple of seconds later they see another body, and one of the people, they run and they try to pull as many bodies as possible out of the river, because at this point they notice there is a stream of bodies like coming down this river. And so one of the people is trying to pull the bodies out and check for the pulse and give CPR, and he or she looks up at their friend and they say, hey, help me out here. Don't you see all these bodies, floating in the river? We need to do something. And the other friend says, I am going to do something. I'm going to run back to the start, of the river and see who is it, who's throwing these bodies in the river. Like, where are all these bodies coming from? And so that, in a nutshell, is the upstream versus downstream, preventative versus after the fact kind of solution focus. So to stick with my homelessness example, if I was interested in preventative solutions of homelessness, I would try to look at what I know causes homelessness. So we know that, homelessness is related to addiction, is related to mental health issues, and it's just related to economic downturns and the cost of housing. So if I know that those are the things that kind of contribute to homelessness, then preventative solutions would focus on preventing people from becoming homeless because of those things, right? I might make more mental health clinics readily available in my community. I would provide addiction centers and halfway houses, for free of charge or sliding income. I would, talk to the government about providing more housing vouchers, and programs to help people remain in their homes even if they've lost their jobs and are in danger of being evicted, right? All of those are preventative measures. After the fact measures is like, okay, I have this homeless population. What do they need in order to make their lives better right now? I'm like, okay, well, if homeless people, they need places to stay, so I'm going to form a shelter, and they need food and warm clothing, so I'm going to do, a drive and a soup kitchen, and then they need some plan to not be homeless. So, maybe I'll partner with some local businesses to try to offer some types of jobs available to them. So all of those, of course, are after the fact measures because the homelessness, the social problem has already happened. Now, in addition to kind of talking about it in terms of ideal, practical, preventative after the fact, we can also talk about social problems in terms of the time that they involve and the focus or scope of the response. So, the time that is involved is for those terms, we use short term, middle term, and long term responses. Short term is what you can do right now. It doesn't require a lot of prep. It's something that is immediate or fairly immediate. Middle term does require a little bit of organization. But once again doesn't necessarily represent a very long time investment in terms of both preparation as well as the solution being offered. Long-term responses usually require a lot more work and preparation in order to get them started, but the trade-off is that oftentimes this solution is meant to be more stable and enduring. So, a short-term response to homelessness, or to a homeless people problem might be, going around your city and offering the homeless blankets or sleeping bags as the weather is cooling down, right? So, hey, if you're going to be on the street, at least you can be warm. This doesn't take a lot of time. It's a very short-term response. It doesn't really address the larger kind of consequences of homelessness. It doesn't address the factors that contribute to homelessness, but it does provide a very limited response in a short period of time. Middle term, once again, requires a little bit of preparation, offers a little bit more ongoing of a response. So perhaps you're like, okay, there's a homelessness issue in my community. I am going to organize a drive on my campus where we are going to be collecting toiletries and warm clothing. And then after we collect these items, and we'll do this, we'll try to do this at least once a semester, or at least for as long as I'm at the college, and we will offer this periodically. That's a middle term response, right? That does require a little bit of planning. It does have the possibility of lasting a little bit longer than just a short-term response, since you're hoping this is going to be an ongoing activity in your college, but you're not sure because of course college students graduate and they move on, so it's not 100% certain that you're putting down any type of stable enduring response. So we call this middle term. Long-term responses take a lot of planning, and usually involves a lot more people. The trade-off is this a much more long-term enduring kind of solution. So maybe you're like, homelessness has increased in my county. We don't have a full-time homeless shelter. I am going to start one. I'm going to reach out to the necessary city officials. I'm going to get the permits. I'm going to find a space. I'm going to involve all of the people that would need to be involved in order to get this shelter up and going. And all of this would take a lot of time, right? But the kind of a positive is that, when it all comes together, what you would have would be a homeless shelter that would then offer resources for a long time to come to your homeless population. So short term, middle term, long term, when you use this terminology, you are referring to the time frame of your solution. The next set of terms, micro level, mid range level, and macro level, now you are instead kind of referring to kind of the scope or the focus of your solution or your response. Micro level is individualistic responses or reliance on primary groups, right? So if you and your family, if you give you donate toys to the homeless shelter for children who are there during the holiday season. That is a micro level response. The focus is kind of on you and your family that's doing this, and you could only really help but so many people, right? However many people you buy for, maybe for that one shelter, it's a fairly limited limited scope, limited focus. Mid-range level, usually at this point you are now involving a secondary group and it's more of a formal organization. It's still at the personal level, but now it's more of the personal slash community level. So perhaps your church routinely every Christmas, every holiday season collects toys for children in the community that are from impoverished families, right? So the focus is broader because now it's not just you and your family, it's an entire organization. And so the idea is that even if an individual family here or there moves away or, drops off doing it or stops doing it, that the solution won't disappear just in case one person or one family decides to not participate, because it's now happening at the secondary group level, right? It's the church, right? So as long as the church exists, this should be something that the church does. And so, this would also be, to go back to the example where you're collecting items for the homeless shelter on your college. Like if it's just you yourself doing it as a community service project, it's a micro level response. But if you form like some type of student organization committed to community service, and this is one of your primary projects, then now it's kind of moved into the mid-range level, and it's the idea that the focus and the scope is broader than what it was previously. And so it's worth noting that social movements, especially if they're fairly small, local movements, they can be an example of a mid-range level response, right? If it's like your PTA and your school, you protest something that happened in school, right? And it doesn't really go beyond your small community. We would consider that to be a mid-range level response. If you form a group in the community that's meant to address something that's largely just kind of related to your community, specific to your neighborhood or specific to your small city or specific to your school, we can call that a grassroots group. And it is existing at the mid-range level. Although it's worth noting that sometimes grassroots groups grow very big, especially if they're related to a national social problem. And in that case, it then becomes a macro level and no longer a mid-range level response. A good example of that is MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Started out as pretty much a fairly local, regionalized grassroots group, started by mothers who had lost loved ones to drunk drivers. And, obviously now today it's a national level organization. Which brings me to the final set of solutions, which is macro level. So macro level solutions are large scale responses. They involve a lot of people. They almost always involve a kind of national level focus. And so national social movement is just like what we described with the smaller social movements, except now we're talking about it being engaged by a large number of people, receiving national level awareness. It's usually related to a social problem that has captured national attention and not just something that exists on the local or smaller level. The civil rights movement is obviously a good example of this. oftentimes with these national social movements, it's not really even about just a protest or a rally. Usually, civil disobedience is plays a large part in that kind of national social movement response, because it's a way of increasing national level attention, which is important at this level. And then we also have special interest groups, which are a macro level attempt. So this is a political coalition composed of individuals or groups sharing a specific interest. And what distinguishes them from grassroots groups is now they are much more explicitly focused on gathering political attention and influencing politicians and political decisions in regards to their in regards to their issue. This requires them to have a lot more people, and it also usually requires them to have a lot more money. As I noted, grassroots groups can grow and expand into this, and there are several examples besides MAD that we could provide that have shown that this is possible. So we will discuss macro level solutions, particularly social movements, in much more detail in the final presentation for this chapter. So I will come back to that, what are the limitations of these types of solutions when we are talking about social movements in the final Camtasia presentation.